Debunking Howard Zinn, Exposing the Fake History That Turned a Generation Against America by Mary Grabar. Introduction. Howard Zinn, icon, rock star. In Good Will Hunting, an emotionally scarred 20-year-old working-class genius endorses a people's history of the United States. During his first visit to his therapist, Will Hunting looks over the books in the office and reads a title aloud. A History of the United States, Volume 1, then comments, "If you want to read a real history book, read Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. That book will knock you on your ass." The message is clear. Zinn's history stands superior to any multi-volume history of America. A genius says so. Will is a natural genius in both math and history. In a bar scene early on in the movie, he inserts himself into a conversation in which Clark, a Harvard graduate student, is challenging a friend who is trying to start a conversation with some young women by pretending to be a Harvard student. Clark challenges Will's friend by asking if he can provide some, quote, insight into the evolution of the market economy in the early colonies, end quote. Will, observing Clark's mini-academic disquisition on the economic modalities of the southern colonies, jumps into the conversation saying, "Of course that's your contention. You're a first-year grad student. You just finished some Marxian historian, Pete Garrison, probably, and you're going to be convinced of that until next month when you get to James Lemon, and you're going to be talking about how the economies of Virginia and Pennsylvania were strongly entrepreneurial and capitalist back in 1740. That's going to last until sometime next year. Then you'll be in here regurgitating Gordon Wood about, the pre-revolutionary utopia and the capital-forming effects of military mobilization." When the grad student begins quoting from the monograph Work in Essex County, Will completes his sentence and gives the page number. As the bar patrons look on with awe, Will accuses the Harvard student of trying to impress the girls and predicts that in 50 years he may, quote, start thinking for himself and realize that he has spent $150,000 for an education he could have gotten for $1.50 in library late fees. In this devastating exchange, Will has knocked down 3 historians in quick succession, leaving only the great of the Zinns in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He and his brother lived with their divorced mother, an education professor who, quote, raised her boys with a deep social consciousness, according to Zinn. When Damon was 10, he took the family copy of the newly published People's History to school and read from it to his class for Columbus Day. And Matt Damon is far from the only American kid who has bought into Howard Zinn's take on our history. Zinn's version of our past, from the discovery of America, Columbus committed genocide, through slavery, worse here than anywhere in world history, the founding of the United States, white slave owners scheming to preserve the status quo, World War II, the Allies weren't any better than the Nazis, and Vietnam, yay, plucky commies defeat the evil American war machine, is widely taught and believed. In fact, it is becoming enshrined as an integral part of young Americans' beliefs. And no wonder. A people's history is taught throughout our schools and colleges. A young people's history of the United States, Zinn's history adapted for middle schoolers with simplified sentences, but the same content, tells young readers that Zinn's radically different version of history was adapted for them because of parents' and teachers' demands. But some adults might object because they feel that young people are not mature enough to look at their nation's policies honestly. If students aren't given Zinn's book, they may read passages from his work in other books. For example, if they check out young adult books by John M. Dunn from the library on such historical topics as the Vietnam War, the North American Indians, then the Civil Rights Movement, each of those volumes contains extended passages from A People's History of the United States, which is listed in the Works Consulted and is described as an unorthodox history told from the perspectives that are often overlooked by mainstream writers. Dunn presented Zinn as a respected historian. And there's good evidence that the College Board, which is, quote, becoming an unelected national school board, setting curricula, and just as important, largely replacing states and localities as the shaper of both textbooks and teacher training at the high school level, end quote, via their framework for the Advanced Placement AP U.S. History exam, promotes Zinn's version of history by including his books in AP teacher training seminars. For years now, teachers have used a variety of editions of A People's History with discussion questions, exercises, lesson plans, and activities. Many of these activities involve role play, a favorite in-class activity of the decidedly non-intellectual Professor Zinn. Students at San Antonio College, just to give one example, learn history from an instructor who has adapted strategies from Zinn, her, quote, mentor. I have been to many teaching conferences throughout the years where Howard Zinn's materials were promoted. One recently retired public high school history teacher in New York City, Jeffrey Ludwig, described how his fellow teachers would photocopy pages of Zinn's book, which was not on the officially approved list, for use in class. According to a college student who recently graduated from that school, teachers were still handing out excerpts from Zinn's book. Many high school students are subjected to Zinn's book in class, along with the America-hating attitude that comes with it. Emily Rentz, now CEO of a clinical trials company she founded, described her horrific experience in Jim Buxton's Global Studies and International Relations classes at South Kingston High School in Rhode Island. Buxton made students read A People's History cover to cover and write papers regurgitating its points. He also bullied students who dared to express opinions that differed from Zinn's. The grand finale was a class visit from Zinn himself, who had been presented as a kind of god when Rentz was in 11th grade in 2005. Zinn's book and visit at Rentz High School enjoyed the blessing of many of the parents. Sam Weinberg, a professor of education at Stanford University and the executive director of the Stanford History Education Group, notes that Zinn's book has become the dominant narrative in many cases and the only history book on the syllabus for future teachers. Zinn's pervasive influence is a national tragedy, especially considering just how distorted, manipulative, and plain dishonest the people's history of the United States is. It's past time to take a closer look at Zinn's outrageous claims and outright lies and set the historical record straight. No other historian has gotten away with as much as Zinn has. Let's begin by putting A People's History of the United States in the context of some recent scandals. It was around the turn of the 21st century when a number of American historians found themselves in the news. In 2000, Emory University professor Deborah Lipstadt was the defendant in a British courtroom for a lawsuit David Irving brought against her because she called him a Holocaust denier in her 1993 book, Denying the Holocaust, The Growing Assault on Truth and Memory. Well-known historians Stephen Ambrose and Doris Kearns Goodwin were shown to have plagiarized portions of their work. Award-winning author Joseph Ellis was revealed to have lied about his own history, about his service in Vietnam and during the civil rights movement to his students and to the media. Michael Belasiles, a history professor, founder of the Institute on the Study of Violence in America at Emory University, and former rising star, was found to have, quote, misrepresented his findings about the rate of gun ownership in early America in an effort to demonstrate the legitimacy of and need for gun control. Irving had never held an academic position or even finished college, yet he had established himself as an historian of the German side of World War II, beginning in 1963 with his first book, The Destruction of Dresden. Although some of Irving's scholarship was respected, much was suspect. His books covered up Hitler's full role in the Jewish genocide and contained factual errors about leaders, events, and statistics. The overall effect was to minimize Hitler's culpability and the number of Jewish deaths. When Lipstadt's Denying the Holocaust was published in England in 1996, Irving sued for libel. History professor Richard J. Evans, who served as an expert witness for the defense, and two graduate students assistants spent 2 years reviewing Irving's sources, a process described by Evans in his book, Lying About Hitler, History, Holocaust, and the David Irving Trial. Irving lost the case. Goodwin and Ambrose were exposed in the pages of the conservative magazine, The Weekly Standard. Ambrose died in 2002, but Goodwin resigned from her post on the Pulitzer Prize Review Board and took a, quote, leave from PBS NewsHour. Ellis was suspended without pay from teaching for a year. Belasiles was initially exposed by Clayton Kramer, who had questioned the Emory University professor while working on his master's degree in history. After much discussion in professional forums, Emory University finally undertook a 3-month investigation. the Emory Committee of Inquiry uncovered evidence of falsification and serious deviations from accepted practice in carrying out and reporting results from research. They found that Belisarius had, quote, violated Emory's regulations on research and the integrity code of the AHA, the American Historical Association, the standard of professional historical scholarship, end quote. As a result, Belisarius lost his contract with Knopf and the Bancroft Prize. He recognized his teaching position at Emory University in 2002. He resigned his teaching position at Emory University in 2002. 10 years later, at the time of the publication of his A People's History of the United States Military, Belisarius was described as a, quote, history buff and reported to be bartending and working as an adjunct teacher at Central Connecticut State University. Meanwhile, another American historian, Howard Zinn, was enjoying increasing success with the book he wrote and published in 1980, A People's History of the United States. More than a decade after its initial publication, sales were so good that an updated and expanded version was released in 1995. The book received a big boost when Matt Damon and fellow actor Ben Affleck incorporated it into key dramatic moments of Good Will Hunting, which won an Oscar. As Irving, Ellis, Goodwin, Ambrose, and Belisarius were disgraced and punished for their dishonesty, Zinn's sales marched steadily toward the million mark. In 2002, Zinn was negotiating with the Fox network for, as he said, an option on the book for a miniseries. The deal fell through. But in 2008, a documentary titled The People Speak, featuring movie and rock stars, was recorded in Boston, California, Toronto, and at Bruce Springsteen's recording studio in New Jersey. In 2003, a third revised and expanded edition of Zinn's book came out, and it passed 1 million in sales. To celebrate, Zinn was feted at a celebrity study party in New York City where A People's History was given a dramatic reading by Danny Glover and James Earl Jones. Zinn, along with Damon and Affleck, was trying to get an HBO television series based on the book. Zinn's editor said that in his more than 40 years of publishing experience, he had not known of another book, quote, that sold more copies each year than it sold the year before, end quote. In 2012, Gilbert Sewell, director of the American Textbook Council, noting by then the sales of 2 million copies, called A People's History of the United States the nation's, quote, best-known work of American history and, quote, the best-selling survey of American history. As of this writing, in 2018, it is estimated the book has sold more than 2.6 million copies. The enormous sales, though, do not mean that there is universal respect for Zinn's work. In fact, in the court of scholarly opinion, Zinn's book is closer to David Irving's Frauds than to an esteemed work of his history. Zinn has been slammed for distortions, omissions, and factual errors by reviewers and historians on both the left and the right. The late renowned historian Eugene Genovese was a declared Marxist in political agreement with Zinn at the time A People's History was published. But Genovese thought the book was so bad that he refused to review it. Years later, he told me it was nothing more than, quote, incoherent left-wing sloganizing, end quote. Liberal historian Arthur Schlesinger called Zinn a polemicist, not an historian. Cornell history professor Michael Kamen began his review of Zinn's history in the Washington Post by lauding Zinn as a radical academic and social activist. But as much as he wanted to pronounce the attempt to write the bottom-up history a success, he said he could not. According to Kamen, the book was a scissors and paste pot job. Too much attention to historians, historiography, and historical polemic left precious little space for the substance of history. Figures of social protest and political criticism crowded out influential religious figures, inventors, intellectuals, and authors. Kamen concluded, we do deserve a people's history, but not a single-minded, simple-minded history, too often of fools, knaves, and Robin Hoods. History professor Eric Foner, who had met Zinn a few times and admired him, gave A People's History a mixed review. 2 paragraphs from the good part of the review have graced the covers of the book. Those excerpts include Foner's praise for writing that displays, quote, enthusiasm rarely encountered in the leaden prose of academic history, with vivid descriptions of events that are usually ignored, and telling quotations from labor leaders, war resistors, and fugitive slaves, end quote. Not appearing on the cover of the book are Foner's criticisms of Zinn's, quote, deeply pessimistic vision of the American experience, in which stirring protests, strikes, and rebellions never seem to accomplish anything, and his portrayal of anonymous Americans strangely circumscribed, with targeted groups appearing either as rebels or as victims, end quote. Foner suggested that the problem with Zinn's book was, quote, inherent in its method, history from the bottom up, though necessary as a corrective, is as limited in its own way as history from the top down, end quote. Zinn gives only a partial view of the history he purports to cover. Michael Kazin, history professor at Georgetown University and an author or co-author of several books on progressive and populist movements, as well as a well-known figure on the left from his days as a leader of the Harvard Students for a Democratic Society and briefly a member of the Weathermen, echoed Kamin's criticism in Dissent magazine, a journal for social democrats that he co-edits. Kazin described a people's history as bad history, albeit gilded with virtuous intentions. That was the nice part of the review. According to Kazin, Zinn's book is unworthy of the fame and influence it has earned and has reduced the past to a Manichaean fable and failed to acknowledge the work and successes of progressives. Despite containing phrases, quote, hinting of Marxism, A People's History is really an insult to the memory of Karl Marx, who, quote, never took so static or simplistic a view of history, end quote. Kazin charged that Zinn's conception of American elites, such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton, is akin to the medieval church's image of the devil. Zinn's failure, he said, was grounded in a premise better suited to a conspiracy monger's website than to a work of scholarship. Leftist Kazin deemed A People's History polemic disguised as history. Stanford education professor Sam Weinberg, in an article in the winter 2012 to 2013 American Educator, called Zinn's history educationally dangerous. He homed in on points in the chapter about World War II, charging Zinn with using evidence selectively, conflating time periods, misrepresenting sources, using dishonest rhetorical strategies, and posing leading questions. Although Zinn drew together material that, quote, blew apart the consensus school of American history of the 1950s, he had substituted one monolithic reading of the past for another. Zinn's history was written in a manner that spoke directly to the students' hearts, but his power of persuasion was dangerous because it extinguishes students' ability to think. A People's History was a history of certainty, and whether the left or of the right, such histories invite a slide into intellectual fascism, according to Weinberg. From the right, Harvard history professor Oscar Handlin attacked numerous claims of fact in Zinn's history in his 1980 review in The American Scholar. He called A People's History a fairy tale with biased selections that falsify events, from Zinn's claim of a widened gap between the rich and the poor in the 18th century colonies to his account of the Tet Offensive. Handlin charged that the book conveniently omits whatever does not fit its overriding thesis. In 2003, Daniel Flynn, then the executive director of accuracy in academia, called Zinn an unreconstructed anti-American Marxist, and his book a cartoon anti-history. A 2012 survey of readers conducted by the History News Network, HNN, a site which trends left, revealed that A People's History was a close runner-up after David Barron's The Jefferson Lies for first place as the least credible history book in print. While the new editions of Barton's flawed book have included corrections, the inaccuracies in A People's History remain. The HNN editors also noted that Zinn received the most intense discussion on the discussion boards, with some commentators on one end commending the book as cheap propaganda and the historian's equivalent of medical malpractice. And yet, A People's History continues to be a phenomenal success. It started with an initial print run of only about 4,000 copies and steadily picked up sales each year, going through 24 printings in its first decade. After retiring from Boston University in 1988, Zinn remained active in the promotion of the book until his death in 2010 at the age of 87. In fact, Zinn died of a heart attack while swimming in a hotel pool in Santa Monica, where he was giving a talk about using his materials in children's education. Throughout his retirement, Zinn continued to travel around the country and abroad for speaking engagements. In 1995, he enjoyed a Fulbright Fellowship in Italy. He was sought out for radio and television interviews, including on The Daily Show. His book was featured on The Sopranos and The Simpsons. He starred in his own film, The People Speak, and the dramatization of his autobiography, You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train. Zinn participated in political activities, often as a speaker at protest rallies, with book royalties and earnings from multiple spin-off products, including films, curricula, and graphic adaptations. Zinn was much better off than the average retired professor. David Greenberg estimated that his franchise was earning him some $200,000 annually. Howard Zinn's death in 2010 pushed his book to the number 4 position on the New York Times paperback nonfiction list.